and welcome. Joining me today is Ed Feser, writer and philosopher living in California, Los Angeles. And Ed, thank you so much for joining me today, for taking the time. I came across your work recently. I read your 5 proofs of the existence of God, which we'll come on to soon, so you can prove God's existence in just a moment. But before then, I was so thrilled, Ed, to find this book. What a great gift this is, All One in Christ. So I'm a teacher over here. I teach in a large London comprehensive, and you can imagine, following the events in America with George Floyd, they were picked up in England, even though we have a very different history. And very quickly, this then all came into schools. And we suddenly found ourselves dealing with issues of racial justice, and all of what started in America swept over here. And it seemed to hit us like a tidal wave. And I, at the time, I thought, this isn't right. There's something wrong. And in Catholic schools, we're turning to critical race theory, and we're having pictures of raised fists and no justice, no peace. And it just didn't feel right in a Catholic educational establishment. And then I found your book. And I thought it was just an absolute must read, and have since passed it on to many teachers and governors who have also, by the way, found it really helpful. So I think I want to start by asking you, why do you think it is that so many Catholics turn to these secular ideologies when our faith, as you've shown in this book, is so rich? And if I can just quote from your first page, the Church's teaching against racism is unambiguous, deeply rooted in her theology, and has been consistently reiterated in her tradition. She has no need for instruction on the subject from the modern secular world. And I completely agree. And yet, this is what we find, is that we do turn away from our faith and to things like CRT. Why do you think that is?
Well, so let me say a couple of things about that. First of all, as you indicate, and as I demonstrate in the book, the teachings of critical race theory are simply flatly incompatible with Catholic social teaching. I don't think there can be any reasonable doubt about that. And it can seem otherwise only to people who are either ignorant of what critical race theory actually teaches, or who are maybe, there's something about it, but they're deceiving themselves and not paying careful enough attention to the details of CRT and the details of Catholic social doctrine. And thereby failing to see the deep contradictions between them. You made reference to raised fists and so forth, and people often complain that, well, it's too simplistic, or it's a right-wing talking point to characterize CRT as a kind of Marxism. Well, it's not a kind of Marxism full stop. There's more to it than that. But there are definitely many important commonalities between critical race theory and Marxism. And one of them is the idea that society is essentially a war or conflict or struggle between inherently opposed groups of people. On the Marxist analysis, these are understood as economic classes. In the critical race theory analysis, they're understood as ethnic groups and races. But the basic idea that there's this inherent conflict between them, that whiteness, for example, is inherently, of its very nature, at odds with the interests of people of color. Well, the Church has condemned repeatedly that idea when applied to the economic sphere. And it follows that the Church would equally well condemn it when applied to the racial sphere. In fact, she has done so when speaking about matters of race. Now, that's just one area. There are many others where there's a conflict between critical race theory and Catholic social teaching in ways that are similar to the ways that Marxism is incompatible with Catholic social teaching. Now, to come to this question you asked about, well, why are Catholics drawn to this? Yeah. It depends on the Catholic you're talking about. With some Catholics, I think it's people who are already otherwise heterodox, and they don't accept the Church's teachings on various matters of sexuality, on economic matters and political matters, where they're at odds with the Church's traditional teaching on those things, and they think the Church is not sufficiently radical. And so this has just become the latest stalking horse in trying to move the Church to what they regard as a more progressive direction and away from her traditional teaching. With others, I think you have Catholics who don't necessarily think that way. They're not necessarily heterodox. They don't necessarily reject the Church's traditional teaching, but they nevertheless find, as goes without saying, that it's very difficult to uphold the Church's traditional teaching in contemporary Western society. It's extremely unpopular. So there has, for some time, for a few decades now, been a tendency for Catholics who are otherwise Orthodox and faithful to soft pedal those aspects of the church's teaching which are at odds with the spirit of the age, and instead to play up those aspects of the church's teaching that can seem to be harmonized with the spirit of the age. Well, the church, as I show in the book, and as you referred to a few minutes ago, has consistently condemned racism for really your entire history, but certainly for the last several centuries in which it's been an issue. Mm-hmm. And so Catholics who have this mindset think, okay, great, this is a way that we can do business with or be on friendly terms with the spirit of the age and not seem to be the bad guy, not seem to be reactionaries. So let's play up the issue of racism. And so to them, it seems like, well, if critical race theory and the so-called anti-racist movement are against racism, the church is against racism, then we're really saying the same thing, aren't we? And so let's take on board this whole apparatus. But the devil's in the details, quite literally here, I think.
Yeah.
Because the fact that someone calls himself an anti-racist doesn't mean that he agrees with the church's particular diagnosis and critique of racism. And as I indicated a moment ago, what the church says and what critical race theory says are very deeply at odds. But I think that desire to kind of be on the same page with the secular world for once is another reason why Catholics sometimes naively and even foolishly think that they can take on board the whole critical race theory and so-called anti-racist movement.
Yeah, I find it very strange. And I think you're right. It's for some, it will be a purposeful attempt to move the church to try and become more progressive. I think it's also a lot of ignorance. I sat in a meeting recently where a parent of a child was saying, well, of course, the church has always been racist and supported slavery. And a member of staff next to me said, yes, you're quite right. and I thought of your book and I thought, well, what are we apologizing? We're so desperate to apologize. And it's almost like this religion. I know it's been described as a religion of nice, that nice trumps everything. And I think the idea is, well, being a Christian is nice. And so if nice trumps everything, then the two can meet. But I think what we see is actually an incoherence, isn't it? If Christ isn't our absolute, if we put something else in the place of Christ, then necessarily we find that it's incoherent because it's not true. And I think that's what we're seeing is this unraveling where we with the transgender movement and with so in other words, like with the racism thing, what I've noticed is actually I've seen racism increase since we've tried to battle it. That's my experience. I've seen people more at odds with one another than they ever were, and yet we're doing more than we ever were to try and combat racism. How can that be?
Yeah, well, I mean, there are a number of things in what you said that I think are relevant to this. So one of them is that, and this is one of the ways in which critical race theory is at odds with Catholic social teaching, is that critical race theory goes well beyond what has traditionally been regarded as paradigmatically anti-racist policy, where, to be opposed to racism traditionally, as reflected in, say, the civil rights movement of the 1960s, was to be colorblind, was to judge human beings as individuals and on the basis of their character and so forth, rather than on the basis of skin color or ethnic affiliation or anything like that. But critical race theory calls for precisely the opposite of that. Right. Critical race theorists argue that absolutely every aspect of society is colored by race and ought to be seen through a racial lens, and that no individual can look at the world except through his or her own racial lens. And one of the implications of this is an obsession of race that really borders on the idolatrous. You end up seeing your racial affiliation as your primary identifier. That's what your life is really about, is what race you are, and you're either part of some victim race, in which case you're supposedly have some special virtue or some special standing for grievance against the world, or you're a member of the so-called oppressor race, and then you have some special guilt that other human beings don't have. But where one way or the other, it's the race that you belong to that determines everything else about your life, and it's your either your affiliation with your race, if you're one of these so-called oppressed racial groups, or your rejection of your race, if you're part of the so-called oppressor class, that defines your moral status, and that ends up being your highest value, your highest affiliation. And this is a kind of bizarre, almost deification of the category of race, and at the very least, a massive exaggeration of it, out of all proportion to the rest of our moral lives. I mean, I would say that the fundamental problems that afflict every aspect of society today are traceable first and foremost to the breakdown of the traditional family, to divorce, to fornication, to the sexual revolution in general. And that stands to reason if someone looks at the world through Catholic eyes, and not just through Catholic eyes, but through natural law eyes. I mean, an ancient pagan philosopher like a Plato or an Aristotle would have understood this, even though naturally I'm not saying that they would agree with every aspect of Catholic morality on these things. But everybody has traditionally known that the family is the cell of society, and if the family is not healthy, the rest of society won't be healthy. And so if you look from this point of view at social problems, that's by far the most important moral issue of the day. But it's also the one thing people want to talk about the least. They don't want to get into that because it's too much a hot button issue. It offends too many people. It's too far against the spirit of the age. So instead they talk about race. And so not only do we have a kind of deification of the category of race, but it also amounts to what I would characterize as a diabolical distraction from the deeper issues that are afflicting society and causing so much of social chaos and various social problems today.
I think that's so important. You tweeted recently, many labor under the delusion that the Christian gospel is people make you feel guilty, but there's nothing wrong with you. God loves you as you are, and in fact, it's not. It's you're a sinner who has merited eternal punishment, but you can be forgiven if you repent, and they're very different. And so we now have a situation where we can't talk about the breakup of the family or any of the things you mentioned, fornication and so on, because all you're doing is judging people, and we're not allowed to do that. And so you can't. Where is the healing? There's no ability to heal if you just say you're fine as you are, stay as you are, which isn't at all what Christianity is. And I think anyone who's actually read the gospel can see that. That's where the
Absolutely. Yeah. So, I mean, there's this emphasis on forgiveness and mercy, and a complete forgetting of what it is we're supposed to be forgiven for, or what justice requires that mercy saves us from. And people pretend as if this, you might say, hyper leniency or excessive emphasis on forgiveness and mercy, as I think of it, is somehow a more refined, purified, consistent application of the gospel. But it's not that at all. I mean, you find in the New Testament, a condemnation of this idea of turning grace into licentiousness or a license to sin. And I think that's exactly what's going on. If the things that are now considered, morally neutral, sexual practices and ways of life that we're no longer supposed to condemn, if the idea is that, well, Christ teaches forgiveness, so we shouldn't condemn those things. Well, if forgiveness means that we should take a more lenient attitude toward those that are enthralled to such sins, that by itself entails they are in fact sins. Now, it doesn't mean you have to sort of preach fire and brimstone to everybody who is enthralled to these sins. That's not always the best approach. Sure, I understand that. But at the same time, refusing to characterize these things as sinful or as things that need repentance it's not an application of the gospel. It's a rejection of it. It's a corruption of it. And the same in the same way, you can't show mercy to someone unless that person needs mercy because they've done something wrong, and that justice would call for a certain punishment or certain treatment that we are mercifully not going to mete out. But that doesn't mean that they haven't done something wrong. So to pretend that there can be mercy or forgiveness without at the same time acknowledging that there are bad actions that one can be forgiven for or shown mercy in the face of, you're getting not only just a one-sided presentation of the gospel, but again, really a distortion of it, a perversion of it, a turning of grace into licentiousness, to use the New Testament. characterization of it.
Yeah, perversion of it. Your story is similar to mine, in fact, and happening really at the same time. I was born into a Catholic family, raised a Catholic, fell away in my 20s, and then through the 90s was an atheist, I would say. So I was saying that, in fact, the only reason I returned to the faith today was encountering people who helped me to see that, you know, in my own pride, I was the center of everything. And I think my worry is that there are attempts now to say, look, the church is for old people. We need to bring young people in. And the way that we do that is to say, you're fine. We'll put rainbow flags on the altar. We'll welcome everybody just as they are. We'll, you know, get everyone under the big tent. But without talking about sin and without talking about our need for God. And it doesn't seem to me that that is working. So what?
Yeah. Well, it's ironic. It's you know, a case where the alleged cure actually just reinforces the illness, reinforces the disease, because people aren't attracted to religion if it's just the same thing that the secular world is already saying. What's the point of it in that case? Especially when you throw on top of that the same people who want to water down the church's teaching, they also tend to be averse to things like traditional apologetics, scholastic philosophy, and what they regard as excessively rationalist a view of religion. Well, on top of the, you know, accommodation morally to the world, that adds a kind of irrationalism in the view of people who are already skeptical of religion. So it's like, okay, if you've got this worldview that, first of all, it's out of sync with the secular world on moral questions, and on top of that, it has no rational foundation, how's that going to attract anybody? And it's unsurprising that young people tend not to be attracted to it. It's you know, it's kind of a cliche that when young people are drawn to the Catholic faith, it tends to be to its more traditional forms. And the same thing's true of other religions, whether it's Protestantism or Judaism or Islam. People tend to be drawn to them precisely in their more traditional and vigorous forms, because it's only then that you actually have something that's an alternative to what's being said by the rest of the world. An old teacher of mine who's died about 10, 15 years ago, but John Hick was a prominent philosopher of religion. And he was definitely, you know, on sort of the opposite side of the fence where I am theologically. But I remember him acknowledging once, I don't know if he did this in print or not, but I know in person he acknowledged this, that it's very difficult to get people to convert to any sort of religious point of view in its liberal form, in its progressive and watered down form, precisely the form that he tended to favor. He was of the view that all religions are really ultimately deep down saying the same thing, and are all approaches to the same divine reality. So, you know, Hick argued that, well, for his sort of position to work, if people convert to religion, they basically have to convert to it in its more traditional form. And then he hoped they would gradually come around to his point of view. So he would just be one example of people on, you know, the other side of the fence theologically for me, who would acknowledge that this sort of thin gruel, theological thin gruel, is not actually attractive to the people, that where it's often sold in the name of attracting the young people. It's not actually attractive to people, or to people who are looking to convert.
Yeah, but that's mystifying. It's not. I can't understand why that isn't seen more clearly, because that seems so obvious to me. And you keep banging the same drum and it's not working. And it's a bit, you know, the same in the culture. We have these things. We have the sexual revolution, and the more progressive and permissive we are, the more problems we see. And so the answer is, let's be even more permissive and even more progressive, without stopping to say, well, hang on, maybe this hasn't been the best approach. And you see the same in the church. The church, you know, we're losing people. Let's, as you've just said, actually, it's the traditional orthodoxy that's attracting young people to convert. And with the synod going on and everything else, it's like that's being missed. And it's just frustrating and mystifying.
I think there's a measure of self-deception here, and in some cases intellectual dishonesty. Yeah. So some people who are selling this, they say, oh, well, you know, the church needs to kind of trim the sails on its traditional teaching, and maybe even change that teaching, or at the very least not say much about it, but emphasize other things. Sometimes that's people who they don't really care about marketing or drawing people in. They just don't like the teachings themselves.
Yeah.
And so they're trying to rationalize a rejection of them by saying that, well, this is the best way to preserve the church. With other people, I think it's not quite as cynical as that, but it's the mentality that I referred to earlier, which is that though they accept the church's teaching, it's very difficult to present that publicly without being pilloried, without being severely criticized. And so they delude themselves into thinking, well, maybe I can be a good Catholic by just not talking so much about that, but talking about other things, and soft peddling those more, from the modern point of view, hard-edged teachings.
Yeah.
And even though, as you say, when you look at the actual evidence, it doesn't seem actually to attract anybody when you speak in this kind of uncertain and way that lacks any sort of self-confidence in the church's teaching. But I think it's not really that people are motivated by a desire to attract outsiders in the first place. They're looking for a rationalization to just not talk about these things, or even to chuck them out altogether. And so they grab whatever rationalization they have at hand, and one of those is, well, we'll attract more people if we don't go on about this sort of thing.
I feel a real pull of tension because I have a number of friends who are members of Opus Dei, and they say we mustn't criticize the Pope, we mustn't criticize the bishops, but they're also Orthodox and believes the church's teaching and would never seek to undermine it. And I feel this pull, and I know I'm very thankful for you and for others like you who do take to task people like Mike Lewis, Austin Ivory, and others, who maybe are pushing more of this, as we've talked about, this idea of capitulating a bit to the spirit of the age in order to, for whatever reason that might underlie why they do it. I don't know the reasons. How could we answer that criticism that actually we want to reveal truth, we want to be a vessel for truth, we don't want to lie to people and not. Well, how can we do that and at the same time be respectful of bishops and the priests and the Holy Father, when in fact, to be honest, I don't know what the situation is like there, we do have bishops and some priests who are at best ambiguous and at worst actively undermining the teachings of the church. What do we as lay Catholics do about that?
Well, I mean, first and foremost, one can uphold and propagate the teaching of the church, whatever the bishops and the Pope happen to be doing. If the Pope and the bishops want to keep silent about certain topics, they can answer to Christ for that themselves. But it doesn't excuse the rest of us from keeping silent about them, and it doesn't prevent the rest of us of keeping silent about them, So, one thing to do is simply to defend the traditional teaching of the church, and leave to one side questions about, well, why doesn't Pope Francis talk about this, or why doesn't this or that bishop talk about it? You don't even have to get into that. You just simply defend the church's teaching, both on its own merits, because all the church's teachings have rational arguments in their favor, and one can put those arguments forward, whatever the Pope or the bishops happen to be saying. And also to note that, precisely as you said, typically those churchmen who do not uphold these teachings themselves, they also tend not to explicitly deny them. They just fudge things. They speak ambiguously, or they change the subject, or what have you. Okay, well, I mean, fine. It's not fine, actually. I would say they're going to answer for that later, if not sooner. But that's on them. We nevertheless don't lose our duty to uphold these things, and one can present those arguments, independently of what churchmen happen to be doing. And furthermore, again, the churchmen in question don't deny them anyway. They typically don't. They just simply speak ambiguously, or they change the subject, or what have you. And what matters in Catholicism is what the church has always taught from the beginning. And that's what the Pope and the bishops exist for, is to preserve the faith once delivered. They don't exist to come up with new and exciting doctrines and to surprise us with novelties and all this kind of stuff. There's nothing in the theology of the papacy or the theology of the role of bishop that calls for that. In fact, the theology of the office of the papacy and the office of a bishop actually prevent that. They forbid that. That's just Catholicism. That's not traditionalist Catholicism. That's not dissident Catholicism. That's just straightforward Catholicism. And people like Mike Lewis and Austin Ivory and all this can obfuscate all they want, and obfuscate is all they ever do. They never present arguments. They just present ad hominem attacks. They change the subject. They badmouth you. They typically are extremely theologically ill-informed. And they don't really care to become well-informed, because what they have a certain agenda. They want to push that, and that's the end of the day all they're interested in. But again, that doesn't either stop or excuse the rest of us from upholding the church's teaching, in the hope that sooner rather than later, hopefully, but eventually, we will have churchmen who will once again have the courage and clear-headedness to present whole and undefiled what the church has always taught. And that will happen. It's just we have to kind of tough it out until it does. The church has been through bad periods before, and this is just the newest one, and it's, I think, in many ways the worst one. But this is the sort of thing that was always bound to happen. There's nothing in the church's teaching about the nature of the magisterium of the church that prevents this specific sort of crisis from happening. It was going to happen sooner or later, and here we are 2,000 years on, and it's happened. But I would say God allows these things to happen precisely to show that the church is not a human institution. If it were, the church would be finished. But it bops along century after century after century. Just when you think it's finished, it comes back, and that's for a reason. Christ allows that in order to bring her back from the brink. So we just need to keep that in mind, take the long view, and not only not lose our courage, but not lose hope, not let ourselves despair. Because the bad guys want that. They want us to give up. They want us to doubt the traditional teaching of the church and leave the field and no longer defend it. And we cannot do that. We cannot permit that to happen.
No, and that's when the accusations come out. You're right wing, you bigot, you racist, all with that attempt to shut you up. And people should laugh at it. It's at this point it's so overused. It's lost much of its force. But people need to stop, and I think people are stopping, but they really need to stop worrying about that kind of stuff and shrug it off. They're going to say that no matter what. Who cares? It's stupid, and everybody knows it's stupid. It's just a matter of how many people who are kind of on the sidelines watching this debate, are going to be willing to uphold this pretense. And the more people who are not willing to uphold it and just laugh and scoff at it and keep presenting the arguments, then the better things will get in the long run. Yeah, I think that those are such encouraging words and so hopeful, because I know a number of Catholics who believe the teachings of the church, but are also terrified. They're terrified of speaking up, of putting their head above the parapet, of losing their job, which is happening and does happen. And I think that there is a call to say, actually, we shouldn't be afraid. We shouldn't lose hope, and we should speak the truth in the culture as far as we can. And you mentioned wings of the church. This narrative of different wings of the church. Well, people say, well, you're more on the traditional wing, but I'm more on the progressive wing, and I've never found that useful or helpful, because there shouldn't be wings of the church. It's you don't have a football club where you're a basketball player in it and the others play football. You're just it's a football club. That's what it is. And in the church, there's the church. It's either you assent to the teachings of the church or you don't, as far as I can see. So I don't understand this talk of the wing. I'm a Catholic who supports abortion, and I'm a Catholic fighting for women priests. And I think, what does it even mean to be a Catholic then?
Yeah, I think this is another rhetorical tool, sometimes maybe not used consciously, but I think sometimes it is used consciously and cynically, which is to politicize the teaching of the church, and usually, often in a way that involves accusing the other side of politicizing it. So if you're a Catholic who upholds what every Catholic has upheld for 2 millennia, you're often characterized as, quote, right wing, as if St. Paul and St. Augustine and St. Thomas Aquinas were somehow all modern, members of the Republican Party or the Tory Party or something. It's ridiculous. But no, I'm just upholding what every Catholic has always upheld. There's nothing political about that. And the very attempt to characterize it as political is itself a kind of politicization. That's the irony of it.
Yeah.
It's people who want to characterize that sort of traditional teaching as, quote, right wing. They're the ones politicizing it. It has nothing to do with politics at all. So I think this is one of these rhetorical tools people use to try to deflect attention, because they're counting on people getting worried. Oh, I don't want to be thought of as right wing. Oh, you know, and so maybe I won't talk about these things. But like these other rhetorical tactics, one should simply have contempt for that and not cave into it, not worry about it, not get apologetic and all this kind of thing, but just press on and call it out for what it is.
Yeah, brilliant. Exactly right. Talking of politics, I don't know if you saw over here, we had the leader of the SNP, the Scottish National Party, Nicola Sturgeon, recently stood down after a debacle over gender self-ID. She wanted to pass a law which allowed anyone to identify as whichever gender they decided. So, you know, with if you're a man, you didn't have to live a certain amount of time, then you could say you're a woman, fine. She's now stood down, and there's a young woman called Kate Forbes who is standing for the leadership, and she has since been, just this week, been trashed because it's been discovered that she's pro-life, she's a Christian, and she supports heterosexual marriage. She wouldn't have voted in favor of homosexual marriage when it came up, and it seems like if you are a Christian in public life, your reputation is ruined if you actually if people find out about this, and you have to keep it in the private sphere.
Well, I mean, there's an inconsistency here because, of course, I don't need to tell you, you already know this, everybody watching this already knows this, that there's an unjustifiable double standard here. So every view is to be welcomed, every view is to be given a place at the table, except traditional Christian morality. That somehow is off the table, somehow that is indecent. And I think the fact that, you know, to go back to this theme that we were talking about a few minutes ago, that there have been too many Christians who get weak in the knees when they encounter that attitude has only encouraged it. When you're constantly apologizing for the Catholic faith, when you're constantly apologizing for and de-emphasizing and soft-pedaling and treating as if there's something indecent about traditional Christian moral teaching, then naturally you're only encouraging people who want to marginalize it and treat it as something that oughtn't to be brought into the public sphere. So people need to stop being apologetic about it. That's one thing here. And also, of course, keep up the point that there's an inconsistency on those who want to use this strategy. If we're really going to be pluralistic and allow all points of view, that has to include the traditional Christian point of view. It can't somehow be the one thing that's not allowed a place at the table. So there's both an inconsistency here on the part of people who push this sort of strategy, and I think also a weakness or unintentional accommodation on those who let themselves be intimidated by it. And I think things are starting to change in that way. I think there are increasingly a number of people who decide, you know what, this accommodationist strategy and this lack of confidence isn't working. And so we need precisely to be less apologetic rather than more apologetic. And you also, you know, you mentioned I didn't follow the story that you mentioned closely, but you mentioned the Scottish politician who, you know, this sort of politically correct strategy backfired on. You know, what this indicates also is that there are a lot of people who don't think of themselves as Christian or Catholic specifically, or conservative or right wing or what have you, who are not comfortable with what's going on. We're not comfortable with the extremes to which questions of sexuality and race and the like have been taken. And some of them are simply intimidated into silence because it's too many people on their own side who are engaging in this. You know, so you have people who are liberals in the old-fashioned sense, see among their ranks people who are farther left and are cowed into silence by the fact that those voices are the loudest ones. But I think that there are more and more people on that side of the fence who are willing to push back against it. And a growing alliance among those and people of a more traditional mindset. And that needs to be encouraged as far as it can be. Because what we're seeing today is not just an attack on moral views, but really on the foundation of society itself, on the family, on social harmony and so forth. Lots of people don't think of themselves as traditionally minded, can see that and are troubled by it.
that we should at least be allowed to question whether the progressive narrative that we all have to agree with, that of course gay people should have the right to marry, and of course everyone should have the right to have an abortion, and of course this a man should be able to identify as a woman, that can there not even be a question, even taking religion out of it, that those things may not be the best things, because that's where we're at. So I think what you said there about being not apologizing, not even making it religious, but the point is you can't even address it from any perspective, because it's just you have to accept this is now a given. All these things are wonderful. If you agree with it, great, you can be a politician. If you don't, naff on. So
yeah. So, you know, one of the comments I would make here is that about to draw a parallel here. About 15 years ago, my book, The Last Superstition, came out, which was a critique of the new atheism, which is kind of a dead issue now, but then was all the rage. And one of the things that impressed people about the new atheism initially was its tremendous self-confidence. And too many people on the Christian side of things, I think, were needlessly intimidated by this.
Yeah. And
they approached it in an almost a kind of apologetic manner. And that was part of the reason I wrote the book, and wrote it in the style I did. Of all the books I've written, and I've written or edited or been involved with about 13 of them, that's the one that is the most polemical, and it's the most vituperative. And some of my readers think, oh, Feser's this guy who's always, you know, kind of on the attack and always vituperative. And well, it's one book, you know, I mean, granted, I've written articles that are like that as well, but most of my articles aren't like that either. But that was a particular case where I thought it was appropriate. And as I've characterized the approach there, I was meeting the other side with superior intellectual firepower and equal and opposite rhetorical firepower. Now, I think that's exactly what's called for at the present moment in response to what everyone wants to call it, wokeness, or some people call it the successor ideology, or critical social justice, or whatever it is. Like the new atheists, these are a bunch of people who are loudmouths. They don't know anything. Intellectually, their ideas are completely worthless. There's nothing of value there. Yeah. But they show extreme self-confidence. And it's that intimidates people. People have to stop being intimidated by it. They have to push back with superior intellectual firepower, which is very easy if you're dealing with someone like an Ibram Kendi or a Robin DiAngelo, you know, these kind of popularizers of critical race theory, because there's no content there at all. It's just garbage, as I show in my book. So with superior intellectual firepower and equal and opposite rhetorical firepower, and some people think, well, if you're a Christian, you know, you need to be kind of touchy-feely, and you can't sort of use fiery rhetoric and all this. Well, I mean, this would be a surprise to the saints and to 2,000 years of Catholic apologists. But putting that to one side, part of the reason this is justifiable is that the force these ideas have and the attraction they have to people is precisely because of the self-confidence of people pushing them. And that's all rhetoric. That's not content. It's a rhetoric. And so you can only meet rhetoric with counter rhetoric. It shouldn't just be rhetoric. There should be intellectual content as well. But you need to neutralize this self-confidence that these people exhibit, which intimidates people. They're so self-confident. I need to approach this apologetically. They shouldn't do that. So anyway, the recipe that I applied and called for when responding to New Atheists, I would say that same thing needs to be brought to bear on this current vogue for, again, whatever you want to call it, wokeness, critical race theory, social justice, whatever.
Yeah, I think that's brilliant. Just to skip back a second, that reminds me of this Compact magazine article, a Black professor trapped in anti-racist hell, that I read. Yeah. I think you shared it as well, that you know, this make it so that it's impossible. People have made it, whether you say it's the woke culture or whatever you want to call it, they want to shut you up. They want to make it so that you cannot. So he talked about seminars that no longer are a long negotiation and discussion and revelation and misstep and then trying to seek truth over months and months and months. They're no longer that. It's you've hurt me, you've oppressed me, shut up. And as soon as you shut down dialogue, then you can't get to truth. And we mustn't let people shut down dialogue.
Absolutely. Everybody should read that article. That was an excellent article in Compact magazine. And it shows you the ultimate consequence of coddling people with this sort of mentality and playing touchy-feely and where we can't offend and we need to worry about people's feelings, and let's just talk about mercy and compassion and not say anything hard. What you do is you make people soft. You make yourself soft too, because you become less and less able to think rationally and logically. So that's one problem. And that's another reason why people, it's a kind of self-reinforcing cycle. People become more and more soft and intellectually flimsy the more they indulge softness and intellectual flimsiness on the part of others. But, you know, if you read that article that you referred to and the obnoxious crybabies that professor had to deal with, it's treating obnoxious crybabies as if they had something important to say. And their feelings had to be validated and caught in all this. That's what produces people like that. And people have to stop that. They just have to stop it and stop thinking and stop feeling guilty for wanting to stop it. Yeah. They shouldn't tolerate that sort of thing. And if someone is just gonna whine and moan and complain, and oh, you're making me feel bad and this kind of thing, instead of presenting an actual argument, they have no place in a university. They have no place in a classroom. They have no place in the intellectual discussion. That's the way things go in intellectual discussion. You entertain ideas, you separate them from the personalities who are presenting the ideas. You evaluate arguments on their own merits in terms of logical consistency, in terms of evidence. And if you can't play that game, you have no business commenting on matters of public debate. And people just have to simply lay down that line and stick to it, come what may. And when you don't, you end up with this sort of, the expression people use now is cry bully, right? People who are very soft, who are totally dominated by their feelings, and who will make a fit, who they will shut down the classroom, they will shut down the debate if their way isn't granted. And we need to stop talking. It's not good for those people either. It destroys souls. I mean, one of the most noteworthy things about that article is how extremely narcissistic these students are that the professor was describing. I mean, they're totally absorbed in themselves and their own feelings, and naturally they're miserable because human beings are social animals and we're rational animals. So when we behave in a way that's contrary to social engagement with others and contrary to our rationality, we're going to make ourselves miserable. So you're not doing people favors by treating them this way and coddling and catering to their softness and inability to deal with hard truths or to engage in rational debate. Nobody wins, including the people themselves. So
yeah, no, exactly right. And they've learned, young people, I think, have learned this language where they talk about hurt and not feeling safe, and then that terrifies adults, and they think, oh, you know, it's again this incoherence caused by this movement, whatever you want to call it, which is on the one hand, we've never been so strict about safeguarding and keeping everyone safe, and on the other hand, we let you do exactly as you please. I've taught abortion for as an ethical issue for about 25 years, and always in the same way, asking questions, begging the question, getting young people to think about things differently. And I teach in a Catholic school, and for the first time ever this year, a young man went home and said he felt unsafe in my lesson, and I had to apologize. Well, I mean, I was asked to apologize for him being hurt, and I thought, what the heck is this? I'm in a Catholic school, and the father said, well, he felt hurt because he felt that you were saying the church doesn't agree with abortion. I said, right, yeah, and you've chosen to send your son to a Catholic school. There's, you know,
well, look, it's insanity. There's nothing. It's not like, well, people are a little misguided. No, it's insane.
Yeah, insane,
and it shouldn't be tolerated. No. You know, I mean, the irony is, of course, people are safer now than they ever have been in human history. Oh. So, you know, if you look at human history, if you look at the history of the Catholic Church, for example, at the very beginning, for 2 or 3 centuries, it's endless martyrdom. It's people being ripped to shreds by lions. It's people being crucified. It's people being subjected to violent deaths of all kinds. You look at the rest of human history, it's a history of people, you know, being brutal to one another. In recent history, the history of the 20th century, you know, you have the ghastly things that happened in Nazi Germany, in Soviet Russia, in Maoist China, and you had people who simply fought against this and dealt with it. And now you have people who are in a classroom and they hear some politically incorrect idea and they get all blubbery and weak in the knees. It's pathetic. It's totally pathetic. Yeah. And also, for most of human history, to just provide for yourself and your family from day to day was a constant struggle. It was difficult to be, you know, a farmer, to be someone who has to work in a factory for 10 hours or whatever, and you know, or work in a coal mine and breathe in coal dust and all this just to put bread on the table. And now, you know, people live more comfortable than they ever have in history. They live like, you know, most kings and queens didn't live for most of human history. And they're going about how they feel unsafe because somebody said something offensive. And 9 times out of 10, it's not really offensive anyway. But and that's probably generous. It's probably almost never actually offensive. But their feelings feel hurt, and then they get all weak in the knees and blubbery. And then you get people who, sometimes people of goodwill, who are not heterodox, but think, oh well, we need to meet these people where they are. And no, they shouldn't be where they are. And it's mentally disordered for them to be that soft, where it does them no good, nor anybody else any good, to coddle that sort of mentality. So anyway.
And young men.
I'll end my rant with that.
I don't want you to. I want you to keep ranting, but I think I know I don't want to take up too much more of your time, but I know young men, especially, I again in education, that we're told boys are there's a problem with boys' attainment. It's not a national picture; it's an international picture, and they're falling behind girls, and girls are getting places at university, and they're falling out of university, and they're in their bedrooms watching porn and playing video games. And the answer, we have a focus group, and the focus groups say we've got to help boys be more like girls because girls are doing well. And instead of looking at what a boy is and what a girl is and recognizing their difference. So there's so much wrong-headedness about the whole thing, but I completely agree. I think we're just, you know, not helping young people to be resilient and to be strong, and for men to be men. And anyway, I'll stop ranting now. A question might be then, what does a Catholic parent do about education? Do you think, I don't know how the schools are there. Here, it's quite difficult to find schools that uphold the teachings. Do a lot of Catholics home educate in the US?
Well, homeschooling is certainly a thing in the United States among Catholics and other Christians, and even some people who are not necessarily religiously oriented, but they find that the school system, both public and private, has gotten so corrupted by these different pathologies that they decide to homeschool. But what you're also seeing is the development of new schools, sometimes founded by families, groups of families who had been homeschooling their children, and found that while there's definitely an upside to that, there's also a downside, because you don't get the social interaction and you don't get the spirit of community that's so important. That ideally and traditionally you'd get from a school-based community. So you do get schools popping up around the country, founded by families who had been homeschooling their children. It becomes kind of almost like an expansion of the homeschool curriculum and homeschool spirit into an institution.
Okay.
And I think this is how a lot of these things have to happen. A lot of the existing institutions, universities, schools, and so on, have become corrupt, and it's very difficult to reform them once they've become corrupt. It can sometimes be done, but it's very difficult, especially when the whole culture is against you. And so the answer to that is to found new institutions to replace the old ones. And so I don't know how this goes in the UK, but you do see that happening across the country in the United States. New institutions founded by people who had been homeschooling, but found that there was a way to get the benefit of that while also having the benefits of the traditional school.
Yeah, it's a little different here because we still have state-funded Catholic schools, and in the US they're private, aren't they? You don't have state-funded Catholic schools, and then because of that, there's a pressure on the Catholic schools from Humanists UK and others who say we should shut down these schools. And so because they're frightened of being shut down, they capitulate more to the spirit of the age, to the secularism, to stay open. And then it begs the question, what's the point in staying open as a Catholic school if you're no longer any different to any other state school? So it's hard to see that the UK won't go the same way as the US and end up having just private, I don't know, we call them private, independent Catholic schools paid for by parents. Right. Well, Ed, if you'd be happy to join me again, because I've only just started to pick your brains and I want to talk to you about my stepdaughter's journey from atheism to theism, and she's a scientist. So with your background, but I think we'll do that another time, because I've brought you to an hour now, and perhaps we could speak again, because that's a whole different topic about your arguments for the existence of God, especially speaking to a young scientific mind. So perhaps we could have another chat.
I'd be happy to do that, sure.
That would be great. Thank you. But for today, thank you so much for your time. And to anyone who's watching, please look up everything that Ed Feser's written. This is brilliant if you're trying to deal with this problem in the culture at the moment. But thank you very much, and keep up the great work. And listen to that call to arms, everybody. We should all be unafraid to stand up and speak truth. Thank you.
Thank you.